Everyone. Happy Monday. It's a rainy Monday in the fall, and we're live on LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and in person. So let's get the ball rolling here. This is gonna be an exciting one. I'm happy. Happy we're doing this one. I've been putting this in the books for a while, but we're gonna get to it. So all right, let's begin. Hello, Smart Money Tree podcast listeners. Welcome to this week's show. My name is Kirk Chisholm, and I will be your host. I'm once again joined with my good friend Doug Hagerin. Hey, Doug.
Good morning, Kirk. Sounds like your weather and your fall weather's coming in same as me. I'm in the Midwest in Minneapolis, and you're out from the East Coast. It sounds like we have exactly the same weather hitting both of us. Fall is definitely in that transition, and I think it's a perfect analogy for some of the things we're going to be chatting about today.
Heck yeah.
Cold and depressing.
Heck yeah, I got my warm clothes on today. I don't have my typical T-shirt that I had in the summer, so it's a chill in the air, and I love it. I love the fall. It's a beautiful time of year, especially in New England. For all you leaf peepers that like it, New England, it's the best time of year to come in. So,
Agreed.
all right, so let's dive right in. So this is a topic I've been wanting to do for a while, and turn this into more of a bigger theme. I know weekly we do this on kind of like what's going on in the news, but this is kind of one of those things where I really love this topic. And there's a website that I found called WTFHappened in 1971.com. So for those of you who want to go look at the charts, we're actually going to share these on the screen, but also those of you who want to do it later, great website for data, charts, whatever. And for those of you who don't know what happened in 1971, we'll tell you at the end. But those of you who do, you need no explanation. So let's dive right in here. So I'm going to share the screen. This is the website. It's just basically a bunch of charts. So we're going to go through this. So what most of these charts are doing is they're showing this. They're showing from the early to mid 1900s until the 2010-ish range, depending on the chart. And it's basically showing that there's an inflection point in 1971. And you can look at all this data, and you say, wow, everything seemed like it made sense until 1971. And then everything went off the rails, right? And you can see this. So I'm going to share the first chart. I'm going to talk through each one. For those of you who are just listening, you don't have to watch this, but I'm going to explain it. So here's a website. So the first thing we're going to do is we're talking about income, household income, compensation, things like that. So the first chart shows growth in productivity and hourly compensation since 1948 up until 2017. Now, if you look at this chart, you'll notice that growth in productivity, hourly compensation was pretty much identical. It's not identical, but if you look at correlation and causation, we talk about a lot in the show, the correlation is really close to 1, which means it's the same. Not 100%, but maybe 99 or 98. It's really close. Now, up until from 1948 until 1971, excuse me, more specifically August of 71, that there was a growth of hourly compensation and productivity, growth in productivity of 90%. Now, since 1971 to 2017, compensation has gone up about 25% in total. But if you look at the chart, it's basically flat. And really what's happened is it's more or less flat. It's peaked up in the last maybe 10 or so years. Otherwise, it's been pretty much the same for that last close to 50-year period. Now, if you look at productivity is skyrocketed. Productivity is up 246%, where compensation is only up 115. So enormous difference in productivity. Well, that could be a good thing, right? And you could blame a lot of things, and certainly the internet had something to do with that, right? And it made us more productive. Everyone's jobs are more productive than they were before because of technology. So, you could say, all right, well, maybe that has nothing to do with it. All right, let's go to the next one. Real GDP, real wages, trade policies in the U.S. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this because it'll probably bore everybody. But if you could just notice that everything was pretty close until 1971. And then there was a big deviation between real median weekly earnings. And those of you who don't understand the real term that basically is inflation adjusted. So just keep that in mind. Income gains widely shared, basically post-war decades and then not since. So real family income between 1947 and 2016, and you'll notice there was pretty much the same. And then it showed the top 95 in the people who were in the 95 percentile, so the top 5% of income skyrocketed since 1971, and the lowest 20% have stagnated. Now, I don't think it's a secret to anybody that the middle class in America has been getting squeezed and is shrinking. And the lower economic classes are certainly having a tough time. And in large part because their income gains are not improving all that much, which tends to be a reason people talk about raising minimum wage because, well, they're still not getting paid enough. But yes, raising minimum wage isn't going to help, but we can get back to that point. But that's why people are getting squeezed, because there's a big difference between the rich and the poor. The differences are getting larger, in large part because of this. I'm going to show the next one, which I love. I did a blog post on this a little while ago, which shows the top 1% of earners is in the red, and the bottom 90% of earners is in the blue or teal. Now, if you look at pretty much the late 30s and 40s, the bottom 90% skyrocketed where the top 1% stagnated until about the 80s. Really, it was 71, but we'll call it the 80s, right? So the top 1% just stagnated, right? Top 90% took off until 1971 and has stagnated since. That's the income growth. It has stagnated for the last 50 years for the bottom 90%. Now, in the early 80s, the top 1% started to skyrocket instead. Now, you could say, well, it's not right because the bottom 90% are not making growth, where they did in pretty much the 40s to the early 70s. They did really well. And you say, well, let's do that again. And we're going to get to obviously why this happened. But the point is they were unequal. Now they're actually closer to equal. You might say it doesn't make sense, it's unfair, but considering in the last 100 or so years, it's actually more equal for the income growth for that 100-year period. So
Well,
just something
and
to keep in mind. Go ahead.
And Kirk, something interesting on that chart is that chart only goes through 2012. So
Correct.
I think, if we could add another 10 years of data, I think it'd be even scarier. What was
I
also
agree.
interesting from that chart really quickly is the last time that the top 1% had exceeded the growth of the bottom 90 was what? 1920, right before the Great Depression. So, I mean, 100 years it took for them to catch up, and look at that spike since 1980. It's crazy.
Yeah, I mean, we'll go back to some of these and we get Doug's opinion as well. But here's the share of GDP, compensation of employees. Not going to spend too much time on that, but you can see a very clear deviation in 1971. Income concentration. Here's another one, same kind of thing. I'm not going to spend too much time here. I do want to spend a little time here. It does talk about a few different things. So here's one. It says the average black income is a percentage of average white income according to the census. And it shows that pretty much the 50s up until 1971, there was a lot of progress in black household income as a percentage of white household income. And then since 1971, there's been a little progress, but very little progress. And of course, no one wants to see one group get no progress as opposed to others. Here's another one on median male income. Now, obviously, there's a big piece of this, which is women actually started to get into the workforce, which is important for the women who want to. I know there's being married and having a wife that works. It's obviously it's not easy when you have kids and all that, and there's a lot of social dynamics that have changed since women got into the workforce, better and worse. But it certainly. If you see here, there's a big deviation at that time, but of course, there's other correlating factors too, which we can't ignore. Here's the same. Here's the real GDP. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. Here's the factor, and then I'm going to cut it and give it to Doug. Now, here's this other chart which talks about America's become a nation of dual income working couples, and it just shows pretty much right around that time that uh, the income of a wife only working family has increased very little. The husband only working has actually declined. Um, and then the both spouses working has increased the most. So it's just interesting to see the data. I'm not going to spend too much time on it because you can draw your own conclusions, but it's interesting when you see a lot of these charts marked against the 1971 date. So, Doug, you want to touch on some of this or move forward here?
One thing I just want to touch really quickly on, the correlation or relation to the male female side of things is, if you take a look at a large swath of the United States is known as the Rust Belt, and the Rust Belt is where there used to be a lot of industry. The auto work was, majority of the work that was done there was a lot had tied to the U.S. auto workers. There's been a significant decline, and we've talked about this in other conversations, in manufacturing in the United States. Manufacturing was predominantly dominated by male laborers, and as that declined, and the rise of the service industry in the United States, which tends to have a lot more participation, if not some, depending on the sector, arguably a much greater number of women involved in the service sector. It certainly does seem to reflect that timing in which the American industrial complex began to certainly decline. If you go back to a lot of these charts too, and you look at the golden age of a lot of these numbers, if you're talking like from the 30s, 40s, post World War II to the 70s and early 80s, again, that correlates to a lot of what people call the American Golden Age. Of an incredible amount of investment and development in infrastructure and corporate corporations in the United States during that period, which again, not only the timing, and again, you talk about correlation and causation of the 70s and some of these changes with regards to policy. But let's also face it, what also hit in the 1970s, Kirk, which again correlated, causated the great, the incredible stagflation period of the 1970s, which, some would argue, did we really ever come out of that? There's been a lot of challenges and problems that have still continued to stem from that. I think that there's been a lot of policy and other things that have helped us to, and again, create wealth in different ways. But if you look at the impact of some of those decisions back then, you look at the 80s and how great of a great growth the 1980s was, until of course we got to the end of the 1980s and the recessions that occurred there before the technology took over, right? And that's the dot-com boom that started in the 90s. But you've touched on a lot of this, so I'm not going to go down very deep on any of that. But that decline of manufacturing, the rise of technology, on a lot of where money was created post, the challenges of the 1970s, it didn't trickle down to those same families it did before. So I'll turn it back to you for the sake of time. We can look at some of these other things you've got listed there.
Okay, so we're gonna go through this, and then I also want to throw it out there for the live listeners. Give us your guess of what you think happened in 1971. There's actually multiple things that happened, but the point of this is actually one very specific event, which is significant.
Yeah, I touched on it, but I didn't want to say it, just to leave a little
We're not
suspense
going
out
to
there.
say it. We're not going to say it till the end. But for those of you who are live, you want to chime in. We're always interested in getting your feedback, and want to see who wins the prize for today for being first. So, all right, let's dive right in. So, all right. So here's some things that obviously we're seeing now, and Doug touched on some of it. There's certainly stagflation of the 70s was an impacting factor, but it was the result, not the cause. The cause we'll get to closer to the end. But as we look in here, I want to bring up this chart about populism, which I think was interesting. I haven't seen someone put this together, but if you look at the era of populists, and then you look at the emerging populism, I'm not sure I could necessarily draw the conclusion here that they are, but it talks about the top 1.1% and the bottom 90. I think the reality is that populism may be something a little bit different, but The reason for populism, I think, is correlated. I think there's a very strong correlation. You could say there's some causative effects there, and I could see some reasons why it's causative, but I'm always careful about saying that there's a causative effect about anything because frequently we think there might be, but we really don't know because it's not one to one necessarily. But let's dive into the cost of living, right? All right. So let's talk about cost of living back in 1971. A new house was $25,000. Doug, I wish I could buy a bunch of houses today for $25,000. There are places in the U.S. that it does cost. You can buy one for 25, but not anywhere near where I live. Um, you're looking at
Yeah.
adding a few decimal points for the Boston area. So, but it's interesting. So this is the average new home. Average income was $10,622 a year. That can you imagine? And now it's like I said, you might add decimal points on that. But new car $3,500. Average rent $150 a month. Um, Tuition at Harvard $2,600 a year. Movie ticket $1.50. Gas is 40 cents a gallon, and a postage stamp at 8 cents. Um, if you look at food, sugar 62 cents for 5 pounds, milk $1.17 per gallon, coffee close to $1 a pound, bacon 80 cents a pound, eggs 45 cents a dozen, hamburgers 62 cents a pound, bread 25 cents a loaf. Now, what I find interesting is there actually are some pretty good websites out there, which will show you the cost, the inflation cost of different goods and services. And I'll try to put some in the notes. There's a great one I found that goes through history and looks at it back as long as you want. It's fascinating. This chart here actually shows the inflation of a can of Campbell's soup. So Campbell's condensed tomato soup has been around, according to this, since 1898 or something like that. It's been around for a while. Sorry, 1898, yes, and until July of 2021. That's how long Campbell's soup has been around. If you can imagine that, I was shocked to learn that it's been around that long. But if you notice that, and actually it's a good data point because it's not some government number, it's not some statistic. This is literally what the cost was for the same tomato soup can that I'm sure the ingredients have changed, but basically the same stuff in the 1900s was like 10 cents. And up until 1971 it was still 10 cents. So you're looking at about 70-year period where the tomato soup can did not increase in price. What happened after 1971? Well, as of today, it looks like as of, yeah, close to today, you're looking at $1. It went up 10 times the price for the same can of soup.
1,000% increase
Yeah.
on that can of soup since 1970. 0% increase beforehand.
And I'm thinking I should be investing in tomato soup right now. That's my new investment recommendation. Don't take my advice, but I'm not an expert in food. But if looking at this chart, invest in tomato soup. I mean, honestly, looking at this, it's kind of scary. And this should be. I love this chart because out of all the charts we're showing you today, this is the one thing that should impress upon you the problems that exist. Is that inflation is a problem, and all of us are getting impacted now, but it's been a problem since. And I think it all stems to really one single event, maybe more, but specifically one single event that caused this. So still looking for your thoughts as to what no one's guessed it yet. And this
It's
is
Monday. Everybody's asleep right now.
I know. We're trying to wake you up.
Wake up!
Wake up! We're trying to shove knowledge down your throat. All right, cumulative inflation. Here's pretty much the last 100 years of cumulative inflation. Shows what it was in 1971. So from early 1900s to 71, you're looking at 300%, and then you're looking from 71 until 2015, went from 300% cumulative inflation up to 2,300%. Skyrocketed since 1971. So those who are listening, obviously the visual parts are a big part of this, but we're trying to explain those numbers are not insignificant. They are enormous differences. So you want to know why you can't afford to put gas in your car? You want to know why you can't afford to fill up your shopping cart and you got to make substitutions for steak? Now you're substituting hamburger. You want to know why that you're stressed out because your bills are piling up? This is the reason. This is a very significant reason why this is happening, and it's not just the last few years. It's not COVID. This has
Kirk, I want
been
to
going
I
on
want to put
since
this
1971. Go ahead, Doug.
Yeah, I want to put this into perspective mathematically. That 300% over, the 60 years from 1910. So that if we take that 300% divided by 60, that is an average of 5% per year. Okay. Since 1970, when it was at 300 to 2,326, so 2,000% increase since 1970 changes to a 40% average annual change.
Wow.
That's massive.
I want to invest in inflation, Doug.
Listen, Bitcoin, what's that? Give me inflation.
give me
I'm
the
just going to start
CPI.
investing in a CPI index.
It's absolutely amazing when you look at these things. And here's the other one. Here's the CPI in the United States from 1775. Those of you who don't know that date, you should probably look it up. 1775 up until 2021. So if you notice, from 1775 up until World War One was pretty stagnant. World War One to basically 1971, went up a little bit, right? World War, if you go to 1971 to today, and just for reference, those are listening. So pretty much from 1775 to beginning of World War One, we're looking at about like the CPI at like $1, like at 1, right? It was stagnant, right? From World War One to like 1971, you're looking from going to 1 to 5. Okay, that's a significant jump. Going from 1971 to today, it went from 5 to 30. So this is not insignificant, right?
Kirk,
And
I have a guess. It was Vietnam. Vietnam did this.
yes, Doug, it was definitely Vietnam. So this chart actually shows a bunch of wars, but I think so it's definitely not Vietnam. That is not the answer to this question. So please don't guess that. But if you look at the wars, right, wars are typically inflationary, right? You look at the Revolutionary War, definitely inflationary. You look at the War of 1812, definitely inflationary. Civil War, like all these times were inflationary. There were times where there was a phrase where it said it's not worth a continental. Just because there was I don't know if it was technically hyperinflation, but it was extremely high inflation of the continentals, which was the dollar of the day. Because they realized like, hey, we need more money, so let's just print it. Well, that didn't work out very well. Fortunately, things didn't end like Zimbabwe, but it definitely didn't end up well. So if you look at these times, there were definitely inflation, right? There were times in our history where inflation happened, but nothing like what happened from 1971 until today. And I impress upon you that it's not insignificant because of the big number changes. Everything seems great. It on the surface it seems great because if you have assets, if you have investments, if you have hard assets, things like that, all of a sudden everything's great because all your assets are going up in price. However, it causes a big divide between the rich and the poor because the poor don't have assets. That's what makes them poor, right? Is that that they're not asset rich like the wealthy. And this doesn't mean that you should go out and lynch all the rich people, right? That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying the rich just happen to either get lucky, which there are rich lucky people, or they're really smart, which is they knew it was happening and they took advantage of it, right? If you know there's high inflation, why wouldn't you invest in things like real estate, right? Why wouldn't you do that, right? And real estate is a good example. People invested in real estate for the last 50 years have made a lot of money. Our last ex-president made a lot of money on real estate, right? It's no secret that real estate has done well in the past. You can look at history, you can look at charts, you could just ask anybody. Everybody knows real estate has done well. Will it continue to do well? I have no idea. That's not the point. But real estate is one of those things that took advantage of this high inflation, right? It is not the cause of inflation. It is the result of inflation in this case. So, Doug, you want to jump on the bandwagon and talk about a few things, and we're getting into real estate here, which I know is your favorite topic.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think, I think what's also interesting is if you take if when just jumping ahead, kind of, not going backwards on a couple of these charts, but if we take a look at the impact of the next chart you've got up there, the St. Louis Fed talked about electricity, food, and fruit, right? And we've said this before that there has been it there is when it comes to inflation, sometimes a lot of what you see in the inflation numbers tends to be a little bit tempered, right? Say, well, inflation's not that bad. Fed comes out and says, look, we're back down to 3%. But this has been an issue for quite some. I remember going back into into the late the early 2000s, kind of the mid to the mid 2000s, and talking about some of these same issues about inflation being, well, inflation's very low right now, and that is probably true if we combine everything together, but not, and we've shown charts on this before, not everything goes up in the same level of inflation as others. And the issue is that while you take a aggregate look at the CPI and you take an aggregate look at inflation and you say, well, look, it's pretty low for the moment. It's only 3%. That also takes into consideration the things that you need and things that you want but can live without. And a lot of the things that you want but can live without have actually become fairly deflationary. A great example on this was going back to TVs, electronics. I mean, it is for what you're getting these days. I mean, you remember, Kirk, back in the days, probably, you're around my age. It used to be a television was a piece of furniture in your house. It was a big wooden cabinet. I mean, it took 15 people to move that thing. And back in the day, that was a massive investment for people to be able to afford to have a TV in their house. Now you can go out and get a 4K 3D, panoramic view television, for a couple $100, right? And now people have them all over the house. So the price for a television has gone from thousands of dollars down to a couple hundred. And that decline in those types of technologies helps to offset the overall inflation. But let's face it, you can live without another TV. You can't live without electricity. And especially the world we're in right now, Kirk, you're definitely not going to be able to live without electricity because they want to run everything off of electricity as we're trying to push everything away to what is arguably a greener form of energy. They're going to be putting more and more demand on electricity. Well, look at that. Electricity has absolutely spiked for the cost of the average household. You take a look at food prices. Now, let's break that down even more because not all food. We saw what happened to Campbell's. And, what I thought was interesting going back to the Campbell's chart is that there were several years where, early 2000s where the price of a Campbell's can actually went from 50 cents back to 30. Like they dropped the price of a can by 20 cents during those periods, which I thought was very interesting to see that happen. And that was before the Great Recession, that they had several times where they priced the price of a can of soup down. But we've talked about things like food deserts. We haven't, but they talk about things like food deserts and the access to healthy foods. Yeah, having canned food on your shelf is great, and great to have something that's preserved and maintained. But you know what? People need healthy foods as well. If you go back to that other chart, Kirk, look at the price of fruit and what's happened as a piece of the entire inflation food aggregate. Astronomical. So what's happening here is you've got to break down the data even further and understand what the impact is to people's budgets when it comes to what they have to pay for every day and the things that we need. Another thing that, they just, they continuing to just talk about, we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, the new strikes on automobiles, right? What's that going to do? Well, it's going to make a lower supply of new cars because they can't manufacture them without help. Then they're going to turn around and then, of course, dealers have to sell something. So now there's data coming out that they're buying more used cars, again, driving the price of used cars once again through the roof to have some sort of inventory available. So now you're going to have high prices on new cars, high prices continuing on used cars. Again, some people would consider this to be a discretionary item. But let's face it, the United States is highly spread out. Now, where you live, Kirk, people can just jump on a train, right? That isn't the case for 90% of America. New England has a better infrastructure than the rest of America does. People have to drive, and it's, nothing's within walking distance. So a car is kind of a necessary thing. So you start looking at food, you start looking at cars. Again, we're going to start getting into housing here in the next couple of minutes, in the next couple of seconds here to talk about. Another thing, people need a place to live, rents up, housing up. The problem that people are facing right now is you can't turn away to find things easily that aren't going up at significantly higher levels of inflation than what they're telling you the average inflation is. Because at the end of the day, the things that are keeping inflation low are things that people can live without. But the things we can't live without, they're going up higher than the numbers are telling you. And this is a perfect example.
I think that's a great point, Doug. And I think that, as we're talking here, we can all sit here and pontificate about, the world, and everyone does this, right? Everyone's, sits around and says, "Oh, wouldn't it be nice if?" But, the reality is that you can look at numbers and throw numbers around, and people in the financial industry like to do that because that's, we like numbers. But, when you start to hear stories about people who can't afford to fill their car to drive to work, they've made the same amount of money for a while, and things are so bad that they can't afford to fill their car to actually get to the job to make the money they need to feed their family. Like, when I hear stories like that, it just shows how bad things are for most people. Now, the top 1%, they're not going to feel that. They're just not. And people in the middle class are starting to feel it, but they're still going to be reasonably okay. I mean, I live in a part of the country where people have enough where, housing and all this stuff is through the roof, but the cost of goods are similar to the rest of the country. So, people who are in the higher economic areas tend to be a little bit more insulated, but most of the country is struggling. And you look at Canada, you look at the United States, you look at UK. UK's got enormous inflation. It's been that way for a while, and so all these inflation is just this really challenging thing that you talk to economists who are like, "Oh, it's good," and they give you all these reasons of like, "No, it's really not." It's it.
Yeah.
There are some. I will point out the benefits that they talk about are it helps the fluidity of our economy, meaning that if there's no inflation and you're not getting any income, then your money is just stagnant. You can put it under your mattress and never use it. And their claim is, well, it doesn't move. There's no velocity, so it doesn't move the economy forward. I can understand that point of view. The problem is that inflation, albeit, does cause us to have a lot of growth. And if you think about all the innovation and the technology and the changes that have gone on, many of which are good things, have come from that too. So it's not really a clear-cut answer, but this is such a subtle and nefarious thing that happens that most people don't realize. It's like being taxed without being taxed. It's like we call it the hidden tax. Inflation is the hidden tax because you're losing X amount of money per year. And let's say you're losing 5% of your money a year and you're making 5% on your assets. Well, you're just breaking even, but you're taking risks to do that. So you're not really breaking even, right? Because at the end of the day, there's still risk, which means you could lose. So everyone loses. The only people who win are the ones who are doing it. Basically, they're investing in hard assets and real estate and things like that. And that's what, and they're leveraging it, which is a big part of why real estate people are wealthy, is because of the leverage. It's not necessarily the real estate. Real estate's great, but it's the leverage and the allowance of leverage that's a huge part of it. So let's talk about real estate a little bit. Be mindful of time here before we get into the end. So this is a chart that talks about the median household price and the median household income. It talks about New York and Boston. Now, if you look at obviously these are wealthier economic areas, but I think it's instructive anyway. If you look at 1971, everything was kind of the same. And then right around the early 80s, which significantly we've talked about on the show, was when inflation started to drop, and also interest rates started to drop as well. And so high interest rates muted the 1971 effect. And then once that was over, median house prices skyrocketed. So they went from approximately 35% up to more recently up to 220%. But huge changes in house prices and the income. The income's increased a little bit, but not significantly. We're talking about 50% in comparison to like 225%. So big difference. Average sales price of homes sold in the U.S. Over the minimum wage has gone up from right around 17,000 up to about 52,000. Big difference in there. You can see the spikes in the chart. Real house prices, rents. House prices have spiked, and this goes back hundreds of years. This I like this. This is for Amsterdam, so it's not just the U.S. This is actually Amsterdam, going back to the early 1600s, and it shows that house prices and rents were pretty correlated. There's some spikes where things, where house prices went up, but then they went back down, but the correlation is pretty sound for hundreds of years. So I like this chart when it goes back hundreds of years. 1971, wow, look at that. House prices skyrocketed and rents were still stagnant. So it just shows you that if you're an asset holder, when you start to have high inflation, you are a beneficiary of this. Whereas people are renting, they're not. So just keep that in mind. How long does it save for a house? It took 2.5 years approximately before 1971. Now it takes 7 years. I think it's just instructive. Home value, income change. So I'm not going to go through all these, but if you look at all these different things, it shows that in real estate it's very significant when it comes to the how real estate has acted in this environment. Once again, a lot of this has to do with leverage. A lot of this has to do with real estate being a hard asset. And if you look back in hundreds of years of history in many different countries, you'll see real estate is one of the things, there's multiple, but one of the things that has kept pace with inflation pretty steadily over hundreds of years. So the benefits of real estate, and I'm not saying you should go out and buy a bunch of real estate because I think it's overpriced, but if you were to, it is the one thing that over hundreds of years will keep pace with inflation, assuming that the past repeats. And you should never make that assumption. But if you were to make an assumption that there's a lot of strong evidence to suggest that it would continue to keep pace with inflation, in large part because people have to live somewhere, right? You could all live in a tent, which is great, but assuming we're not going to live in tents, we're going to live in houses, and that's not going to change, then you should assume that the future should be relatively correlated to the past. And I think real estate's become very unaffordable for a lot of people, especially if you were to buy today. But doesn't mean it'll be that case in the future. So just keep in mind that's a big part of why real estate's gone up, is because of this inflation. Doug, you want to take a few of these?
Yeah, well, I want to add too. I think you made a great point that real estate has kept up with inflation, but also I think as one of those truths, half truths kind of scenarios is that, and again, especially in the short term cycle, and who knows, this could be the new normal. We talk about that potentially can happen in different areas, but a lot of people see that, especially residential real estate, as this great, opportunity to make tons of money in a short period of time. It's also a reminder to people out there, if you go back and look at the price increase, especially of residential real estate since the end of the Civil War, it's, as you said, it's kept up with inflation, but it's barely kept up with inflation. It's basically kept up with inflation. So it hasn't historically been a place where you just drop your money in and get a 2x or 4x return, which again has happened more recently in the cycle. But you and I have talked about this too. You can there's a lot of factors you can contribute to that, a lot of which being potentially correlated or causated by very low interest rates and easy money for an extended period of time in this economy that we've been in, which is now starting to change. So that again will create an opportunity to revert that back to the mean. The other thing I thought was interesting is how long does it take to save for a house? It actually dipped 2020. Now, granted, this is 2020, so there was a little bit of impact there with potential with COVID, but the fact that it stayed relatively flat since 2000 was a surprise to me. Although, and I'm seeing more and more things now about people saying it's going to be harder and harder to at these current prices to save enough for down payment. I will say this. I don't know because again, within the data, where's this coming from? It's remained flat since 2000, 7 years to save for an average house. But what is required to save that money? Is that now two workers versus one? Is that just household income? So are they being able to save the down payment of a house, but now two people are having to work to do that? I'm not sure that data shows as much, shows that information there that I think is really critical to say, because it's like, oh, we are now bringing enough money to buy a house, but the both of us, where one of us could do that alone before, now both of us are working, going back to some of the charts we looked at. Again, home value versus income change, not a surprise there. Income, all these other charts have showed the same thing, that income has really stagnated, although there has been a little bit of an income change, and a couple of charts are showing income change over the last 5 to 10 years has started to climb a little bit again. Now, why is that? Some of that might be due to technology. Again, technology and a service industry, a lot of technology wages have really spiked over the last 5 to 10 years, as there's been a higher and higher demand for people in tech. They've had to pay more and more. That could be offsetting the trend a little bit. So it's like, look, wages in general are going up, but who's getting those wages? Again, I'm not sure that on the trickle down side of things, there's a lot of people who are seeing that same increase in wage growth, but certainly not keeping up with the house values. There's been tons of published about that ad nauseum, about where home values have gone, recently. Now that's going to bring us into gold, and I don't want to dive into gold here on these charts. I'm going to turn this back to you on this, because I think this creates a good narrative for a continuation of our conversation here around some of the topics today. So.
Great. So we got about 10, 12 minutes left. So we're gonna put final calls in for what people think happened in 1971. So we've gotten a lot of questions. No one's really gotten it yet, but a lot of good questions. And so I want to point out one thing, and then we're going to get to the answer. So for those of you who are waiting diligently for us to actually answer the question, we'll let you know in about 2 minutes. So I want to get over this one more chart, because I think I love this chart here, which is, it shows hyperinflationary episodes. So this shows from the early 1900s until today, and it shows prior to 1971. So if you look at the early 1900s, obviously there were some events over in Europe, and this is worldwide, by the way. So this shows Europe, Asia, Latin America, Africa, whatever. So it shows all these different instances. You'll see in the early 1900s, for obvious reasons, there was hyperinflation in Europe. In the 40s, there was some in Asia, specifically China, Philippines, and Taiwan, and in Europe, Hungary and Greece. And then there was really a period from the 40s until 1971 where there was nothing. And then starting in 1971, we had our first hyperinflationary event in Nicaragua. And if you look in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s, there was a ton of hyperinflationary episodes. Interesting. Why didn't these happen in the past? Well, it probably has something to do with 1971. Now, obviously, a 20-year difference is not necessarily directly correlated to 1971, but it is interesting that you start to have all of these in the early 90s, 20 years after the event, which also happened to be going from high inflation down to low inflation, and then you start to have all these events, and we're still having them. We have Venezuela today. We had Zimbabwe a few years ago. It's a problem. So last calls for questions, and I'm just going to tell you. So all right, well, no one's got it. I'm surprised, Doug. We usually have some pretty smart people, but maybe they're working on a Monday morning. So, all right, we're going to talk about it. What happened in 1971? Well, technically in 1971, I think it was August 15th, if I'm not mistaken, the U.S. Went off the gold standard. And so I want to talk a little bit about this. And those of you who didn't hear my debate this weekend, we had a debate, gold versus Bitcoin, we've done this on the podcast before, and we did it on a separate location. So those of you who are interested in listening to the new one, please let me know. Just shoot me an email, and I'll send you the link. Basically, what happened was Nixon took us off the gold standard, and he did it because we had to. Because our policies at home were, let's say, not keeping up with the standard that we promised, which was that we'd be able to exchange gold for dollars, right? So if the foreign exchange was such that the French said, "Hey, you guys aren't balancing your books," and they said, "We want the gold," and what was happening, actually, France was a big part of this. What would happen is they say, "Oh yeah, well, we want gold. We don't want dollars. We want the gold." Right? Because they knew there was a misbalance and they were just basically arbitraging it. They're saying, "We want the gold, not the dollars." And so gold, which had flooded into the US after World War II, started to flood out because people were like, "Wait a minute, your numbers don't make sense. We want our gold." And so gold started to flood out until the point where they realized, "Hey, we're gonna have to close this because we can't continue this way." And at the same point, they couldn't balance their books because of other reasons. So the point was, is this 1971 marked the U.S. going off the gold standard, so it was effectively 100% fiat. Now, back in the 30s, we went off a different gold standard, so it was different, but that was another one that we went off. But in the 70s was the big one, and you can look at the 30s, you can look at the 70s, and obviously you can decide which one was more important in the statistics, right? You can say yes, technically we also went off the gold standard in the 30s, but we also went off in the 70s. Well, the 30s and 70s, the difference wasn't significant. From the 70s on, it was hugely significant, as we talked about today. So really, it was going off the gold standard. We had nothing marking our dollar to a reasonable value. And since then, we printed up trillions of dollars and we've used it for various purposes, but it has caused the printing of money causes inflation. I had somebody make a comment last week on YouTube about minimum wage. I forget the comment specifically, but it was something around the lines of, well, minimum wage isn't the only thing that causes inflation. Like, how do you do that? I'm like, well, yes, it's only one of the things that causes inflation. If you raise everyone's prices, everyone has more money, which means everyone spends more money, which means prices go up. It's a self-reinforcing cycle. So raising minimum wage does cause price to go up. It's not. It's a little bit more complicated, but effectively, the government printing of money is a big cause of inflation. Another cause of inflation, because the government technically doesn't print money, the banks do, and the banks do it by leverage, and the banks aren't lending. So normally, in a normal environment, the banks would get $100 and they would turn it into $900, let's say, right? Because they get $100, you deposit $100, and they loan out $90 of that or $80 of that, right? So they loan that out, and then that person takes that money, puts that $80 back in the bank, and then the bank takes it like, I'm going to loan that out, right? They're going to loan out $70 of that, right? And then 60. So it's this. I don't want to get into math, but basically they multiply it by a few X. Banks actually create money by lending it out, right? That's the whole premise of the banking system is creation of money. And if the Fed wanted to, raise or shrink that, they would change the standards. But now banks aren't lending because it's a highly risky endeavor right now for banks to lend, and the government has made it very strict on them to lend. So what happens? Well, the government prints the money, and they print up trillions and trillions of dollars, and it's taken us hundreds of years to get to 10 trillion in government debt, and then they do it in in a short period of time. So the inflation currently being caused is by the government, and that is a big problem. And they're able to do this because the dollar is not tied to gold or anything. It doesn't have to be gold, right? It could have been oil, could have been a rock, could have been a piece of real estate. It doesn't matter. It's tied to something of value. Right now, it's not tied to anything of value. It's tied to the um, to the good faith payment of the United States. Oh yeah, we'll pay you. Yeah, you're good. Your money's good here. The problem is people don't trust it, and the more that we lose trust in the dollar and the government, the closer we get to hyperinflation. Hyperinflation is not necessarily high inflation. High inflation is high inflation. Hyperinflation is when people lose trust in the currency. It's when they say, we don't want to hold this garbage. We want to hold something that has value. So they get rid of it. They get rid of it as quickly as possible. I'm going to buy bread. I'm going to buy gold. I'm going to buy real estate. I'm going to buy something because that will have value. The currency is worthless. That is what hyperinflation is. The more you have higher inflation, the more likely hyperinflation is going to happen. Now, currently, it's not in the cards because of what's going on. But it is a risk down the road if we have poor policies here in the U.S. So, Doug, I want to give you a chance before we wrap it up, but yeah, thoughts from you.
Yeah, so Kirk, I think one of the things. Again, we don't have time to go into this, but if you want to look at a little bit of history, if you're a history buff, go look up the Bretton Woods system. I mean that started basically in the 1940s. It actually started before that, but 1940s was the latest turn of the Bretton Woods system, and it was basically to get all the countries on the same page so that there would be less political instability between them regarding the currencies. Again, not getting deep into that, but what I thought was what happened in 1971, and you're right, you are correct. It was August 1971. Is it effectively dissolved the Bretton Woods system with a temporary suspension of the dollar's convertibility into gold. By the way, let this be a fair warning to anybody who ever thinks anything the government does, they say is temporary. It never is. When they do something, they never go back on it. So just remember that when politics start to come out with their rhetoric. But effectively, they were running into the dollar had struggled throughout most of the 60s within parity established at Bretton Woods. And of course, that ended up being a breakdown of the system. An attempt to revive the fixed exchange rates failed. And by March 1973, other major currencies began to float against each other the same way. And so, again, I'm not going to get into the details of it based on time, but it is a fascinating read for those that are history buffs that like to kind of understand the evolution of our economic policy and what has occurred there. I did post a chart, Kirk, that shows the price of gold, and you can find that on the files that we updated. But the price of gold from early 1970s, you can't even see any growth in the price of gold. Between 1910 to 1907, there is absolutely nothing showing on the chart because the price of gold change was so insignificant prior to this change. And so the impact that had on gold, because even though gold was no longer tied to currency, and you'd think that the currency would create a high demand for gold, again, this is coming back to the impact of inflation that trickled down from these changes in 1970 to present. And ultimately now, I like to call, as you were saying, Kirk, how's the value being determined? Let's just call it the because I say so value, right? Because that's effectively what the Fed is doing. And that is why interest rate policy that we have seen happen so much. And every quarter we talk about the Fed getting together and discussing what interest rates, that all really stems from the change that occurred with the end of Bretton Woods and leaving the gold standard officially, in 1971, because now it's all tied to how the Federal Reserve determines what those interest rates are going to be, and therefore affecting what the dollar is going to be against with inflation. So, again, we're right up against that hour, so we can continue to have this conversation another time. Again, since we're talking about inflation, I've talked about this before. I know you're out there. I know if you have kids in high school, okay, and really, you should be starting this much earlier than high school. If you're planning for how to pay for college, this is an area where, again, we have seen as much as double-digit inflation in the 1980s during short periods of time. It's still easily twice what normal inflation is on an average growth. It is the biggest concern of most people with kids is how am I going to pay for college, but also the stress of going through that process. There is a lot of things that you can do to not only lower the cost, but lower your stress. Go to our website, procollegeplanners.com, download free information, get the information before you start to do the shopping, because I assure you, this is what I believe. The college game, it's gamed against you. And if you don't have the information, you're going to lose. So even the playing field, get the information, and maybe we're a resource for you.
Great. Well, thanks again for coming on the show, Doug. Always appreciate your insight. And that's the show for this week. So thank you again for joining us, Money Tree Investing Podcast. My name is Kirk Schism, wealth manager of Innovative Advisor Group. We don't just manage your wealth, we make your life better. You can find more about me at innovativewealth.com. And of course, you can find me every week here on the show. Please remember to subscribe to the podcast and the podcast app of your choosing. You can also check out the show at moneytreepodcast.com. On the website, you'll have access to the show notes, resources, and the archive shows. Also, we're now on YouTube. Those of you who are listening to it live know that we're on YouTube. Please check out the YouTube channel. When you're there, please subscribe and leave a comment. Lastly, please leave a share rating and comment on the podcast app of your choice. Oh, and don't forget, do your own research. This show is for informational use only. We're not telling you what to think, merely how to think about investing. We're not selling any products or services, so do not consider this advice. If you have any problems with the show, I blame Putin. Please send him an email and express your feelings. If you're seeking financial advice, talk to an oracle, or a fortune teller, or maybe just a licensed financial advisor. I'm one, but as said earlier, I'm not selling anything. But I'm easy to find. Have a great week ahead, and remember, no one will care about your money like you do. So invest in your life.